On most Tuesdays, the United States Postal Service delivers our mail at 11:30, with the reliability of Fritz's morning coffee and about as much fanfare. I slit the envelopes with the same letter opener I've been threatening to sharpen for 3 years, sort the bills from the checks with practiced efficiency, and watch Nero Wolfe's eyebrows perform their daily dance over correspondence that ranges from tedious to merely dull. The routine has a comfortable predictability, like a well-rehearsed waltz between civilization and chaos. That particular Tuesday in March, however, the mail decided to waltz with a limp. I was at my desk in the office, pretending to organize receipts while actually contemplating whether Fritz's lamb stew would justify a second helping, when the doorbell rang with the assertive tone of someone who had walked a considerable distance to deliver bad news. I crossed the hall, opened the door, and found myself facing a messenger whose cap had seen better heads and whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "You Mr. Wolfe?" he asked, squinting past me into the foyer. "Not on weekdays," I told him. "Let me guess. You have something that must be placed directly into Mr. Wolfe's hands, no substitutes accepted, on pain of losing your pension." He looked at the envelope in his grip, then back at me. "Says here delivered to Mr. Nero Wolfe personally. That's extra." "Everything worthwhile is extra these days. What's your name?" "Eddie." "Eddie, you're about to have the rare privilege of entering a house where the furniture has better manners than most people. Come in." He stepped inside with the cautious air of a man entering a museum after hours. I left him admiring the coat tree and went to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had learned to read. It was 20 minutes before noon. His orchids commanded his attention until 11. Then he read until lunch at 1. Disrupting that schedule required either an act of God or a retainer large enough to fund a small revolution. "A messenger insists on seeing you personally," I reported. "He has an envelope and principles." Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "Inform him that my threshold is not a receiving line. You are perfectly capable of accepting mail." I tried that approach. He's been trained to resist charm. Then inform him that I am not a post office box with legs. I returned to Eddie, who was studying the parquet floor as if it might contain the secrets of the universe. "Hand it over," I said. "I'm Mr. Wolfe's secretary, bodyguard, and occasional voice of reason. He's occupied with matters of international botanical importance." Eddie weighed his instructions against his desire to collect his fee and return to the street. Commerce won. He gave me the envelope and accepted the bill I offered with the resignation of a man who knew when he was outmaneuvered. After he left, I examined the envelope. Heavy stock, expensive feel, addressed in a neat feminine hand. Mr. Nero Wolfe, 454 West 35th Street, New York. Below that, in smaller letters that made my eyebrows climb toward my hairline, "Deliver only if no postcard has been received by Monday, March 14th. Today was Tuesday, March 15th. I slit the envelope carefully. Inside were 4 items: a folded sheet of cream-colored paper, a brass key with a round tag stamped GCT 247, a newspaper clipping, and what appeared to be half of a postcard. The picture side, with the message side torn away. The typed note was brief. "Mr. Wolfe, if this reaches you, I failed to send the postcard I promised. Please don't contact the police." He monitors the mail and watches the phones. "If you're willing to help, please keep my promise for me. HBPS. Tell Archie I'm sorry I couldn't send that postcard from Lake George." That stopped me cold. I'm Archie, and while I've received promises of postcards from various members of the fair sex over the years, most of them involving scenic views and declarations of undying affection that lasted about as long as a New York minute, this one rang a specific bell, a very pretty bell, attached to a very pretty girl who had sat in our office last July with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice. The newspaper clipping was from the previous Thursday's Gazette. a small item about an upcoming exhibition at Faber and Pine, Rare Prints and Ephemera. The City by Postcard, New York, through the mail, 1900 to 1950. The photograph showed a distinguished gentleman in a vest standing beside a display case filled with vintage postcards. The brass key was obviously from Grand Central's parcel room, a service I thought had gone the way of hat checks and courtesy, but apparently still functioned for those who preferred their secrets stored rather than mailed. The torn postcard showed a view of the Palisades from somewhere along the Hudson, the kind of scenic vista that made city dwellers temporarily nostalgic for nature. Across the bottom margin, someone had written in pencil, "Map." I carried the collection to Wolfe's desk and arranged the items where he could see them. He glanced up from his book with the expression of a man whose perfect morning had just developed a crack. "Someone didn't send us a postcard," I announced. "She apologizes for the inconvenience." Wolfe examined each item with the methodical attention he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. When he reached the note, his eyebrows performed a small symphony of disapproval. "HB," he said, not as a question. "Hazel Bell," I confirmed. "The insurance case last summer. The one where I bought lunch and she promised to send me a postcard from Lake George." "Ah." He set the note aside and picked up the key. "And she has chosen to privatize her correspondence, along with half a postcard and a newspaper clipping about old postcards. Either she has a theme or someone does." Wolfe studied the torn card, turning it over to examine the rough edge where it had been separated from its mate. The word "map" suggests this fragment has significance beyond its scenic value. The whole thing suggests someone is playing games with the mail system. The question is whether we want to play along. Before Wolfe could answer, the doorbell rang again. This time it was a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of sensible coat that suggested she had walked a considerable distance in questionable weather. Her face bore the particular strain that comes from worrying about someone you love. "Mrs. Lake," I said, recognizing Hazel Bell's aunt from our previous encounter. "You look like someone who's been expecting bad news." "Mr. Goodwin." She stepped inside, shaking rain from her umbrella. "Hazel told me that if I didn't receive a postcard by Monday, I should come here on Tuesday at noon. It's Tuesday, it's noon, and there was no postcard." I led her to the office, where Wolfe was regarding our collection of mysterious items with the expression of a man who had just discovered that his perfectly ordered world contained an equation that refused to balance. "Mrs. Lake," he said, rising slightly from his chair in a gesture that passed for courtesy. "I assume you're here about your niece." "I am." She settled into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone who had been carrying worry like a physical weight. "Hazel left me specific instructions. If no postcard arrived by Monday, I was to mail you that envelope and come see you myself. She said people were better than paper, especially when the paper might be dangerous." "Dangerous," Wolfe repeated, tasting the word. An unusual characteristic for correspondence. She said someone was reading her mail, watching her phone calls. She was frightened, Mr. Wolfe, though she tried to hide it. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which creaked its familiar protest. "Tell me about the postcard that didn't arrive." "Hazel works for a magazine called Gulliver. She writes travel pieces, small things about places most people will never visit. 3 weeks ago, a man named Silas Faber asked her to write about his postcard exhibition. She was excited about the assignment, said it would be a nice change from writing about hotels nobody could afford. And the postcard she promised to send? She was going to Lake George for research. We used to go there when she was little after her parents died. She said she'd send me a postcard when she arrived, just like old times. But also," Mrs. Lake hesitated, glancing at me, "she promised Mr. Goodwin one too. Said she owed him a debt of gratitude." Wolfe's gaze moved to the items on his desk, then back to Mrs. Lake. "When did you last speak with her?" "Sunday night. She sounded careful, like someone who was choosing her words because someone else might be listening. She reminded me about the envelope, about coming here if no postcard arrived. Then she said something odd. "Auntie, if you don't hear from me, tell Mr. Wolfe that sometimes the most important message is the one that doesn't get sent." The office fell quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of Fritz preparing lunch in the kitchen. Wolfe stared at the torn postcard, his massive frame motionless except for the slight movement of his breathing. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Lake, my fee is $50 a day, plus expenses. I require a retainer of $500. If I take this case, you will pay whether I find your niece or not. If I find her and she chooses not to return, you will accept that decision. Are these terms acceptable?" "Yes." "Very well." He looked at me. "Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him I may have work for him. Then call this Silas Faber and arrange a meeting. If he objects to the timing, inform him that postcards wait for no man." I reached for the phone, but Wolfe held up a hand. "First," he said, "take that key to Grand Central and discover what our missing correspondent chose to store rather than mail. Be circumspect. If you observe anyone taking unusual interest in your activities, abandon the errand and return immediately. And if the locker contains something interesting, bring it. If it contains something dangerous, leave it and call me. If it contains something both interesting and dangerous." He paused, considering. "Use your judgment, but remember that discretion is the better part of staying alive." I pocketed the key and reached for my hat. "Any particular reason you're taking this case? Missing persons aren't usually your specialty." Wolfe picked up the torn postcard again, studying the penciled word map as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer concentration. "Because, Archie, someone has gone to considerable trouble to ensure that a simple postcard would not be sent. They have succeeded in preventing its delivery, but they have failed to prevent its message from reaching us. That suggests either exceptional stupidity or exceptional cleverness. In my experience, the latter is far more dangerous than the former." As I headed for the door, Mrs. Lake called after me. "Mr. Goodwin, if you do find Hazel—" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell her that not sending a postcard has caused more commotion than any postcard she could have sent." I promised I would, grabbed my coat, and headed out into the March afternoon. Behind me, I could hear Wolfe beginning his interrogation of Mrs. Lake, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when a case had captured his interest despite his better judgment. The girl who sent no postcard was about to discover that sometimes the most effective way to deliver a message is to make sure it never arrives. March in Manhattan treats pedestrians like unwelcome relatives. It tolerates them, but makes sure they know they're not particularly wanted. I pulled my coat tighter against the wind that seemed determined to relocate my hat to Queens and made my way through the organized chaos of Grand Central Terminal. The parcel room clerk had the tired eyes of a man who had been accepting other people's secrets for too many years to be surprised by anything. I handed him the brass key, and he disappeared into the maze of shelves behind his counter with the enthusiasm of someone fetching yesterday's newspaper. He returned carrying a manila envelope, thick and substantial, sealed with red wax that had been applied by someone who took their privacy seriously. I signed the ledger with a flourish that would have made my third-grade penmanship teacher proud, and found a quiet bench near the information booth to examine Hazel Bell's deposit. Inside were 3 items that made me understand why she had chosen storage over the postal system. The first was a small collection of antique postcards, not 6 or 60, but exactly 12, each in a protective sleeve. These weren't tourist souvenirs. They were the kind of cards that made collectors reach for their checkbooks and their smelling salts simultaneously. Views of old New York, hand-tinted and pristine, each bearing a small pencil mark in one corner, tiny notations that looked like a code waiting to be cracked. The second item was a reporter's notebook, its pages filled with Hazel's neat handwriting. The entries were dated over the past 3 weeks, beginning with her first meeting at Faber and Pine, SF charming but evasive about sources. claims all pieces authenticated, but won't discuss methods. A. Pine handles acquisitions. Nervous when I ask about recent purchases. Exhibition includes postcards that shouldn't exist. Views of buildings demolished before postcards became popular. Either someone has a time machine or someone has a printing press. The curator with the star pin, Werner, watches everyone who gets too close to the display cases. Not security. Something else. The final entry, dated last Sunday, was written in a shakier hand. They know I know, moving the real evidence to GCT. If something happens, the map isn't geographical, it's chronological. Follow the dates. The third item was a photograph, black and white, showing Hazel seated at a restaurant table with 3 men. One I recognized from newspaper society pages as Silas Faber. The other 2 had the kind of faces that suggested they had learned to smile while calculating odds. Someone had written on the back, "The lunch where everything changed." I slipped everything back into the envelope and headed for the nearest phone booth. A businessman was conducting what sounded like a negotiation and involving either livestock or his mother-in-law's will. I waited with the patience of a saint and the impatience of a New Yorker until he finished. Wolfe answered on the first ring. Yes? The locker contained postcards, notes, and a photograph, I reported. Our missing correspondent was documenting something more complicated than a simple exhibition. She thought Faber was passing off reproductions as originals, and she had evidence to prove it. What manner of evidence? Postcards showing buildings that were demolished before postcards existed. Either someone invented time travel, or someone has been very creative with a printing press. And the photograph? Hazel with Faber and 2 gentlemen who look like they learned arithmetic by counting other people's money. Return immediately. I've scheduled Mr. Faber for 4 o'clock. Mrs. Lake has provided additional details about her niece's recent concerns. I hung up and made my way back through the terminal, paying closer attention to my surroundings than usual. A man in a grey overcoat seemed to be taking unusual interest in the departure board, but when I stopped to check my watch, he boarded a train with the resigned air of someone who had missed his preferred departure time. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office with Mrs. Lake, who looked as if the past hour had aged her considerably. The original items from Hazel's envelope were still arranged on his desk, creating a display that resembled evidence in a case that was becoming more intriguing by the hour. Mrs. Lake has been explaining her niece's recent behavior, Wolfe said as I settled into my chair. Apparently, Miss Bell had developed an interest in home security. She bought new locks, Mrs. Lake added, expensive ones. Said someone had been in her apartment, moving things around. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. I placed the manila envelope on Wolfe's desk. She was right to be careful. According to her notes, she discovered that Faber's exhibition includes postcards that couldn't possibly be authentic. The doorbell rang with the sharp insistence of someone who had news to deliver and places to be. I glanced at the clock. 3:30. Too early for our appointment with Faber. I opened the door to find a young woman with auburn hair and press credentials clipped to her coat. She had the alert expression of someone who had learned to ask questions faster than people could think of evasions. "I'm Janet Price from the Gazette," she announced. "I understand Hazel Bell has disappeared, and you're investigating. I think we need to talk." Janet Price had the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was accustomed to arriving at crime scenes before the police finished drawing chalk lines. I let her into the office because turning away a reporter is like trying to stop rain with an umbrella. You might stay dry temporarily, but you're going to get wet eventually. She settled into the red leather chair with the practiced ease of someone who had made herself comfortable in 1,000 uncomfortable situations, and regarded Wolfe with the steady gaze of a professional who had learned that silence often extracted better quotes than questions. "Miss Price," Wolfe said, inclining his head the precise distance that courtesy required, and no more. "I assume your interest in Miss Bell extends beyond the usual journalistic appetite for misfortune. Hazel called me last Friday, she replied, removing a small notebook from her purse with the automatic gesture of someone who documented everything. She was excited about a story she was working on, said she'd stumbled onto something that would make our art forgery expose last year look like a church social. Mrs. Lake leaned forward, her hands gripping her handbag. What did she tell you? She was being careful, said her phone wasn't safe, that someone was monitoring her calls. We arranged to meet for coffee on Sunday, but she never showed. When I tried calling afterward, her landlord said she'd left town suddenly for a family emergency. Janet's eyes moved to Mrs. Lake. But you're her family, aren't you? I am, and there was no emergency. I pulled the reporter's notebook from the manila envelope and set it where Janet could see it. According to her notes, she discovered that Faber's exhibition includes postcards showing buildings that were demolished before postcards became popular. That's either a miracle of time travel or fraud on an impressive scale. Janet examined the notebook, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline as she read. This is more sophisticated than simple forgery, she said finally. Look at these dates she's tracking. They correspond to major real estate transactions in the city, buildings that were torn down, lots that were sold, developments that were built. Wolfe's fingers performed their familiar drum roll against his desk blotter. You believe Miss Bell discovered someone was creating false historical documentation? Postcards that prove certain buildings existed at specific times, Janet confirmed. Think about it. Property values, inheritance claims, insurance settlements, zoning disputes. Any number of financial arrangements depend on historical accuracy. If you can manufacture evidence that a building existed longer than it actually did, or was more significant than records indicate, you can justify higher valuations, support insurance claims, or establish historical significance for landmark protection, I finished. That's not just fraud. That's fraud with a real estate portfolio attached. Mrs. Lake's voice was barely above a whisper. And Hazel discovered this. She was documenting it systematically, Janet said, tapping the notebook. But there's something else. She wasn't the only one asking questions about Faber's sources. A man named Klaus Werner has been making inquiries. Claims to be a collector, but he asks the wrong questions. Too technical, too specific about authentication methods. Wolfe opened his eyes, which had been closed in concentration. Describe him. German accent, 60s. Always wears a small star-shaped pin on his lapel. Very precise, very polite, but there's something calculating about him. He's been to 3 different exhibitions in the past month, always asking about the same thing. Provenance documentation for pre-1920 New York postcards. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, like a jigsaw puzzle where the edges were becoming visible even if the center remained obscure. I glanced at the clock. 3:40. Faber would arrive in 20 minutes and Wolfe was still in information-gathering mode. Miss Price, Wolfe said, your concern for Miss Bell is commendable, but I require something more substantial than concern. What can you offer beyond speculation? Access, she replied promptly. The Gazette has covered the art and antiquities market for 30 years. I know which dealers talk to each other, which collectors have grudges, and which authentication experts can be bought. I also know that Faber and Pine has been unusually active in acquisitions over the past 6 months. They've purchased 3 major collections, all from private estates, that seem to have materialized from thin air. And in exchange? Exclusive access to the story when you solve it. My editor will want attribution, but I'm willing to wait for the complete picture rather than rushing to print with half-truths. Wolfe considered this with the careful attention he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. Very well. But you will follow my instructions precisely, and you will not publish anything without my explicit permission until the case is resolved. Agreed. The doorbell rang with the measured authority of someone who expected to be admitted without delay. 4 o'clock exactly. Silas Faber had arrived with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece. "That would be Mr. Faber," I announced, rising from my chair. "Should Miss Price remain for the interview?" "She should," Wolfe replied. "But she will observe, not participate. Mr. Faber's reactions to an unexpected audience may prove instructive." As I headed for the door, Janet called after me. "Mr. Goodwin, when you bring him in, watch his hands. Hazel told me that people who handle valuable objects develop specific gestures. The way they touch things, examine them. If Faber's been handling reproductions regularly, he might give himself away without realizing it." I promised to keep my eyes open and went to admit our 4 o'clock appointment. Behind me, I could hear Wolfe beginning to arrange the items from Hazel's collection on his desk. Not randomly, but in a specific pattern that would be visible to anyone seated in the red leather chair. The girl who sent no postcard was about to have her story told by the man who had received her message loud and clear. Silas Faber entered our office with the measured confidence of a man who had spent decades convincing people that old things were worth new money. He was smaller than his newspaper photograph suggested, but carried himself with the kind of careful dignity that comes from handling other people's treasures and charging them handsomely for the privilege. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, extending a hand that Wolfe acknowledged with a nod but didn't shake. His eyes moved to Janet in the yellow chair, then to Mrs. Lake by the window. "I wasn't expecting an audience." "Miss Price is documenting my methods," Wolfe replied. "Mrs. Lake has a personal interest in the proceedings. Please sit." Faber settled into the red leather chair, and I immediately understood what Janet had meant about watching his hands. As he arranged himself, his thumb and forefinger came together in a small, unconscious gesture, testing thickness, weight, quality. The motion lasted barely a second, but it was there. Wolfe had arranged Hazel's collection of antique postcards on his desk in a neat grid, faces down, revealing the stamp boxes and postal markings. The torn postcard lay to one side like evidence waiting to testify. "You recognize these?" Wolfe said. Faber's hands performed that testing gesture again as his eyes moved across the display. I recognized the type. Early 20th century views, various printing methods, well-preserved examples. "Miss Bell preserved them," I said, "along with detailed notes about your exhibition." His fingers stilled. "What sort of notes?" Wolfe picked up one of the cards, a view of the old Astor House. She noted that several postcards in your collection bear ASIO stamp boxes with triangular corner markings indicating production between 1904 and 1918. Yet they depict buildings demolished before 1904. "There are explanations," Faber said smoothly, but his hands had moved to his lap and remained motionless. "Later, reprints from earlier negatives, cataloging errors. New York's historical record is hardly infallible." "Miss Bell thought your exhibition traded in something more deliberate than error," Janet said, earning a sharp look from Wolfe, but pressing on. "She believed someone was manufacturing historical documentation." Faber's composure cracked slightly. "That's a serious accusation." "It's an observation," I corrected. "It becomes an accusation when we decide whether to make it formally." Wolfe held up the photograph from Hazel's collection. "This shows you dining with Miss Bell and 2 other gentlemen. She captioned it, 'The lunch where everything changed.' Explain." Faber leaned forward, and his right hand moved toward the photograph before he caught himself. The motion was automatic, professional, the gesture of someone accustomed to examining paper quality, print clarity, age indicators. "Adrian Pine, my partner," he said, indicating the figures in the photo, "and Klaus Werner, a collector who consults on authentication matters." "Werner," Wolfe repeated. "German gentleman, 60s, wears a distinctive star-shaped pin." The name hit Faber like a small electric shock. His hands performed that testing motion 3 times in rapid succession. "You know Werner. We know he's been asking detailed questions about authentication methods at various exhibitions, questions that suggest more than casual collecting interest." Mrs. Lake spoke for the first time since Faber's arrival. "Where is my niece?" Faber turned to her, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Bell completed her interview and mentioned a family emergency. She said she might go upstate for research. That was our last contact. Yet her notes suggest she discovered something that made her fearful," Wolfe said. "Something that required storing evidence in a Grand Central locker rather than trusting it to the mail." "I wouldn't know about that." I watched his hands. The testing gesture had become more frequent, more pronounced. "Mr. Faber, you've performed the same motion with your thumb and forefinger 17 times since you sat down. It's the gesture of someone who regularly examines paper quality, print methods, aging characteristics. Someone who handles both authentic historical documents and modern reproductions." His hands froze entirely. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Miss Bell's notes indicate that your recent acquisitions include 3 major collections from private estates with no public documentation. She believed these mysterious estates were providing you with postcards that shouldn't exist, historical views created after the fact to support various financial interests. Property valuations, insurance claims, landmark designations," Janet added. "Any number of profitable arrangements depend on historical accuracy." Faber stood abruptly. "I don't have to listen to speculation presented as fact. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it to the proper authorities." "Sit down," Wolfe said quietly, but with the authority that had convinced better men than Faber to reconsider their positions. "You came here to discover what Miss Bell had learned. Now you know we possess her research, her documentation, and her evidence. The question is whether you prefer to explain your involvement now or wait for less comfortable circumstances." Faber remained standing, but his defiance was clearly costing him effort. "What do you want to know?" "Tell me about Klaus Werner's role in your business." The question drained the color from Faber's face. He sank back into the chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "Werner isn't just a collector. He's a specialist in documentation services." "Meaning?" "He creates provenance for objects that need historical legitimacy." Faber's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Birth certificates for artworks, you might say." The office fell silent, except for the scratch of Janet's pen and the distant sound of Fritz preparing dinner. Wolfe studied Faber with the expression of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. "And Miss Bell discovered this arrangement?" "She asked too many questions about technical details. Paper composition, printing methods, aging techniques." Faber's hands had begun trembling slightly. "Werner said she had become problematic." "Where is she now?" Faber's answer came out as a whisper. "I don't know, but I'm afraid Werner might." The revelation that Klaus Werner specialized in creating false provenance hung in the office air, like smoke from an expensive but dangerous cigar. Faber sat in the red-leather chair looking like a man who had just discovered that his life insurance policy had been written in disappearing ink. "Werner's operation is more sophisticated than simple forgery," Faber continued, his voice gaining strength as confession replaced concealment. "He creates entire historical narratives. A building that existed for 6 months becomes a significant landmark that operated for 3 years. Minor commercial properties transform into important cultural sites with documented heritage value." Wolfe's fingers drummed against his desk blotter in the rhythm that indicated maximum mental processing. "And your role in this documentation theater?" "Legitimacy through exhibition. Werner provides the manufactured evidence. I provide the public credibility. Once postcards appear in a reputable gallery, showing they acquire authentication by association. Collectors assume proper due diligence has been performed." "A circular authentication process," I observed. "The exhibition proves the postcards are genuine, and the postcards prove the historical claims are accurate." Janet looked up from her notebook. "How many properties are involved?" "Dozens, possibly more. Werner handles multiple clients, Property developers, insurance companies, family trusts claiming historical significance for tax advantages. I only see the postcards that need exhibition credentials. The doorbell rang with sharp insistence. Through the window, I could see Saul Panzer's familiar silhouette and knew he had discovered something worth immediate reporting. I brought Saul into the office, where he surveyed our assembled group with professional assessment. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression that meant significant but unpleasant discoveries. Werner maintains a workshop in a converted warehouse on the Lower East Side, Saul reported. Professional printing equipment, aging chemicals, paper stocks dating back 50 years. He's been producing historical documents for at least 3 years. And Miss Bell, Mrs. Lake's voice carried desperate hope. No sign of her at the workshop, but evidence she'd been there recently. A coffee cup with lipstick, a notepad with her handwriting. Also this. He opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a handwritten ledger page with names, dates, and substantial dollar amounts. The client list read like a directory of Manhattan real estate power. Developers, insurance firms, legal practices, all paying impressive fees for historical documentation services. There's more, Saul continued. Werner's been asking questions about you, Mr. Wolfe, specifically about cases involving missing persons who discovered inconvenient information. Faber shifted uncomfortably. I may have mentioned Miss Bell's previous consultation with you. When? Wolfe's voice carried the particular edge that meant complete honesty had become the only acceptable policy. Sunday night. Werner was agitated about Miss Bell's failure to appear for our scheduled meeting. He said she had become too dangerous to ignore, that some problems required immediate attention rather than patience. Mrs. Lake's face went pale. What kind of immediate attention? Before Faber could answer, I noticed something that made my blood temperature drop several degrees. The grid of antique postcards on Wolfe's desk, arranged with his characteristic precision, was no longer perfect. One card, a view of the old Croton Reservoir, sat slightly askew. More troubling, the pencil notation in its corner looked different, thicker, altered. Someone has been in this office, I announced, pointing to the displaced card. That postcard has been moved and the marking changed. Wolfe leaned forward, his massive frame suddenly radiating controlled fury. He examined the card with intense scrutiny, then surveyed the entire arrangement. The violation of his sanctum, his perfectly ordered world, had transformed the case from intellectual exercise to personal affront. Indeed, he murmured, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that preceded storms. Someone has dared to tamper with Miss Bell's evidence in my own office. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Werner wasn't just a forger operating from a distance. He had agents capable of infiltrating the brownstone itself. The game had escalated beyond missing persons and document fraud into direct confrontation. Janet stopped writing entirely. If they can get in here, they can get anywhere, I finished, which means Hazel is in more immediate danger than we thought. Wolfe placed the altered postcard precisely back in its original position, but his eyes remained fixed on it as if memorizing every detail of the violation. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the cold determination of a man whose patience had been systematically destroyed. "Saul," he said quietly, "institute immediate surveillance of this building. Anyone approaching within 50 yards is to be identified and followed. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Inform him we have evidence of breaking and entering in connection with a missing person case." He turned to Faber with eyes like winter. "You will remain here until this matter is resolved. If Miss Bell comes to harm because of your association with Werner, your cooperation will not save you from the consequences." The brownstone's sanctity had been breached, and Nero Wolfe was no longer merely solving a case, he was defending his fortress. Inspector Kramer arrived at 8 o'clock, with the punctuality of a Swiss watch and the disposition of a man who had been personally insulted by the concept of crime in general. I met him at the door, noting that he'd brought Sergeant Stebbins and a photographer, which meant he was taking our break-in seriously, despite his telephone grumbling. "Someone walked into Nero Wolfe's office and rearranged evidence," he announced, lighting a cigar with the resigned air of someone whose evening plans had just been sacrificed to duty. "Either this city has developed a very polite class of burglar, or your missing person case just became something more interesting." I led them to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had been personally affronted by geology. The tampered postcard lay in its precise position, but the violation of his sanctum radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "Inspector," Wolfe said without rising, "someone with professional expertise has dared to enter my home and alter Miss Bell's evidence. This represents escalation beyond simple fraud into direct confrontation." Kramer examined the displaced card with methodical attention, then surveyed the entire arrangement. Any idea how they managed entry? "The same systematic precision they've applied to monitoring Miss Bell's communications and accessing her apartment," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Faber has been explaining Werner's operation. Employs specialists with particular skills for particular problems." Faber, who had grown increasingly pale during the proceedings, shifted uncomfortably. "Werner doesn't work alone. Document authentication requires access to restricted archives, private collections, institutional records. He has contacts who can obtain materials through unofficial channels." "You mean thieves?" I translated helpfully. "Acquisition specialists," Faber corrected with the desperate precision of a man clinging to euphemisms. While Kramer's photographer documented the scene, I excused myself for field work that couldn't wait for official procedures. Hazel's apartment on West End Avenue still held the keys Mrs. Lake had provided, and I wanted another look before Werner's people decided to make additional visits. The building's pre-war respectability masked the kind of careful surveillance that comes from residents who've learned to notice strangers. I used the service entrance and Mrs. Lake's key, finding Hazel's apartment exactly as I'd left it. Too exactly. Someone had been maintaining the careful arrangement, which meant they expected return visits. I worked systematically through the desk, using the pencil-rubbing technique that had served me well in previous cases. The blotter revealed impressions from Hazel's recent writing. KW2's 6 p.m. Starbox test. Dry run. Verify cancels via Postal Club registry. The air near the bookshelf carried a faint chemical tang. Camphor and gum arabic, the kind of aging agents Werner would use for his documentation work. He'd been here recently, or one of his specialists had worn his cologne as a calling card. Under the desk, taped like a secret badge against the world, I found a cheap spiral notebook with 3 pages remaining. On the top sheet, Hazel had written, "Chronology is the map. 12 cards, sampled 12 dates. Properties with disputes line up to dates, not addresses. If I'm spooked, the other half of Palisades. Answer key. The other half." I felt the familiar detective's itch between my fingers where a missing piece should fit. Back at the brownstone, I found Saul Panzer had returned with news that transformed the case from missing person to active pursuit. Werner's Lower East Side workshop had been professionally evacuated. Equipment removed, records destroyed. No forwarding address. But the dumpster behind the building contained fragments of burned documents, including letterhead from the New York Historical Society. "He's been using institutional credentials to access private collections," Saul reported, representing himself as a legitimate researcher. Before we could fully digest this development, the phone rang with providential timing. Dr. Margaret Thornton from the Historical Society had discovered that 17 postcards from their permanent collection had been replaced with sophisticated reproductions over the past 3 months. More significantly, she'd received a call yesterday from a young woman researching postcard authenticity for a magazine article. The caller had identified herself as Helen Barnes and asked specific questions about Klaus Werner's recent visits to the archives. "Helen Barnes," I repeated, feeling the pieces click into place. "HB, the same initials from her note to us. Miss Bell is alive and continuing her investigation from a safe distance," Wolfe concluded with satisfaction. "The question is whether Werner has discovered her location." The phone number Dr. Thornton had been given belonged to a hotel in Albany, close enough to New York for research access, far enough for safety. Kramer stubbed out his cigar with unnecessary force. "I'll have Albany police check that hotel, but if she's using false names and staying mobile, finding her won't be simple." "It may not be necessary to find her," Wolfe said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tampered postcard with the cold determination of a chess master who had identified his opponent's weakness. "If we can force Werner into the open, Miss Bell may find us." He turned to Faber with an expression that could have frozen July. "You will call Werner and arrange a meeting. Tell him you have Miss Bell's evidence and are prepared to negotiate. Inform him that her disappearance has attracted official attention, that continued association with him threatens your business reputation." "He'll never believe I would betray him," Faber protested weakly. "You won't be betraying him, you'll be saving yourself. Offer to sell him her research materials in exchange for his guarantee that she will not be harmed." As Faber stared at the phone with the expression of a man contemplating his own execution, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a general who had just maneuvered his opponent into an untenable position. The girl who sent no postcard was about to discover that sometimes the most effective way to flush out dangerous game is to offer them exactly what they think they want. Faber's phone call to Werner at 10:15 that morning carried all the conviction of a man trying to sell insurance to his own executioner. I listened on the kitchen extension while Wolfe sat motionless behind his desk, his fingers performing their familiar drum roll against the blotter, a sure sign that his mind was operating at maximum efficiency. "Klaus, we have a problem," Faber began, his voice achieving the perfect blend of desperation and calculation that Wolfe had coached him to deliver. "The Bell woman left more than just notes. She left a complete documentation of our arrangement with a private detective." Werner's response came in the clipped precision that marked him as someone who had learned English from legal documents. "What manner of documentation?" "Postcards from your work, photographs of our meetings, detailed notes about authentication methods, everything needed to destroy both our businesses." Faber paused, letting the implications settle. "The detective is Nero Wolfe. He's demanding $25,000 for the materials in his silence." The pause stretched long enough for me to count 3 of Wolfe's finger taps. When Werner spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, the focused attention of a predator who had scented prey. "Where is the woman now?" "I don't know, but Wolfe might. He insists on meeting tonight at 9 o'clock, his office. He says if we don't agree to terms, he'll turn everything over to the authorities tomorrow morning." "Mr. Wolfe does not leave his chair for business meetings." "He doesn't have to. He's holding all the cards. Literally, the postcards you created, Klaus." She documented every piece. Another pause. Then, "I will come, but I will examine the evidence before any money changes hands. If this is deception, Mr. Faber, you will find my response educational." The line went dead with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The preparation. The next 10 hours transformed the brownstone into a carefully orchestrated theater of psychological warfare. Wolfe directed the staging with the precision of a master conductor preparing for a performance where a single wrong note could prove fatal. "Saul," he instructed, "position yourself in the front room with a clear view of the office door. Fred will monitor the kitchen entrance. Ori takes the second floor. Sight lines on both the office and the street approaches." Inspector Kramer arrived at 7:30 with the resigned air of a man who had learned that Wolfe's theatrical methods, however irritating, generally produced results. "My men will be positioned outside, but they stay hidden unless things go wrong." This Werner character sounds like the type who'd disappear permanently if he spots official surveillance. Janet Price established herself at the IOMA second-floor window with a camera borrowed from the Gazette's crime desk. "I'll document everything from up here," she promised. "If Werner brings associates, we'll have their photographs." But it was Wolfe's arrangement of the office that revealed the true sophistication of his trap. He positioned the 12 antique postcards from Hazel's collection in a precise grid on his desk, each one carefully angled to catch the light from the green-shaded lamp. The tampered postcard, the Croton Reservoir view with its altered date marking, occupied the position where anyone seated in the red leather chair couldn't help but notice it. "The psychology is crucial, Archie," he explained as I adjusted the lamp to his specifications. "Werner will examine these cards with professional instinct. When he sees his own alteration, he will be unable to resist the impulse to assess his handiwork. That moment of professional pride will confirm his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt." Mrs. Lake sat quietly in the corner chair, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes bright with desperate hope. "Will this bring Hazel home safely?" "It will bring us the information necessary to locate her," Wolfe replied with more confidence than I felt he possessed. "Werner's greatest weakness is his conviction that he is the most intelligent person in any room. That arrogance will compel him to demonstrate his superiority, even when silence would serve him better." The arrival, and precisely 9 o'clock, our doorbell announced Werner's arrival with the measured authority of someone accustomed to being admitted without question. I opened the door to find a man smaller than his reputation suggested, but carrying himself with the careful precision of a master craftsman. His star-shaped lapel pin caught the light from the foyer chandelier, and his eyes performed a quick professional assessment of the brownstone's interior before settling on me with calculating attention. "Mr. Goodwin, I presume? I am Klaus Werner. Mr. Wolfe is expecting me." I led him to the office, noting the way his gaze catalogued every detail, the position of furniture, the location of doors, the arrangement of objects that might serve as weapons or obstacles. This was a man who had survived in dangerous professions by leaving nothing to chance. Wolfe didn't rise as Werner entered, merely inclining his head the precise distance that courtesy required. "Mr. Werner, please sit." Werner settled into the red leather chair with fluid grace, his briefcase balanced on his knees, his eyes immediately drawn to the grid of postcards on Wolfe's desk. I watched his hands, and there it was, exactly as Faber had described. His thumb and forefinger came together in a small, unconscious testing motion, the gesture of someone who had handled thousands of documents and developed the instinct to assess paper quality, printing methods, and age characteristics at a glance. "You have Miss Bell's research materials," Werner said, his accent lending an oddly formal quality to the words. "I have her documentation of your business methods," Wolfe corrected. "The question is whether you consider that research worth $25,000. Werner's eyes moved across the postcards again, and I saw the moment when his professional assessment overcame his caution. His gaze lingered on the tampered Croton Reservoir card, and his thumb and forefinger gesture became more pronounced. He was examining his own work, unable to resist the craftsman's impulse to evaluate his technique. "These are interesting pieces," he said carefully. "May I examine them more closely?" "By all means." Werner reached for the tampered card, and as his fingers made contact with the paper, his expression shifted subtly. The careful neutrality was replaced by something approaching satisfaction, the look of an artist admiring his own creation. "The Croton Reservoir," he murmured, turning the card to examine the altered pencil marking. "March 1918. A significant date for property valuations in that district." "Indeed," Wolfe said quietly, "particularly when the original marking indicated March 1913, the actual date of demolition." Werner's hand froze. The card remained suspended between his fingers as the implications of Wolfe's statement penetrated his composure. For the first time since entering the office, his professional mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold intelligence beneath. "You know," he said, "and it wasn't a question. I know that you altered evidence in my own office," Wolfe replied, his voice carrying the particular edge that meant complete honesty had become the only acceptable policy. "I know that you manufacture historical documentation to support fraudulent property claims, and I know that Miss Bell discovered your methods and documented them thoroughly enough to destroy your entire operation." Werner carefully placed the postcard back on the desk, his movements now carrying the deliberate precision of someone who had recognized that the game had changed fundamentally. "Where is she?" Mrs. Lake's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Werner turned to regard her with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "Miss Bell is conducting research in a location where she cannot cause further difficulties. She is alive, comfortable, and will remain so as long as certain conditions are met." "What conditions?" I asked. "The complete destruction of her research materials, the cessation of any investigation into my business practices, and the guarantee that no information about my clients or methods will be shared with authorities or journalists." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which creaked its familiar protest. "And if these conditions are not met?" Werner's smile carried the chill of winter morning. "Then Miss Bell's research will become incomplete, permanently." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of traffic on 35th Street. Werner sat perfectly still, his briefcase balanced on his knees, his eyes moving between Wolfe and the grid of postcards with the patient attention of a chess master contemplating his next move. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "Mr. Werner, you have made a fundamental error in calculation." "Have I?" "You assume that Miss Bell's evidence exists only in physical form. You assume that her research can be destroyed by eliminating documents and silencing witnesses. But you have failed to consider that some forms of evidence exist independently of their original sources." Werner's composure cracked slightly. "Meaning?" Wolfe smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had just maneuvered his opponent into an untenable position. "Meaning, Mr. Werner, that the most damaging evidence against you is not what Miss Bell discovered. It is what you have just confirmed through your own words and actions in this room." The trap had been sprung, but the game was far from over. Werner's eyes hardened with the realization that he had walked into something far more sophisticated than a simple extortion attempt. The girl who sent no postcard was about to be found. But first, her captor would have to confront the full implications of his own arrogance. Werner's briefcase sat on his knees like a shield that had already failed its primary function. The careful composure he'd worn into our office was developing cracks that would have made a building inspector nervous, and Wolfe was applying pressure to each fissure with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the right amount of force, applied to the right weakness, could bring down entire structures. "Mr. Werner," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the particular weight that meant complete honesty had become the only acceptable currency. "Your position has deteriorated beyond salvage. You have confirmed your authorship of fraudulent documentation, admitted to holding Miss Bell against her will, and threatened her safety contingent upon my cooperation. These admissions, made in the presence of witnesses, constitute confession to multiple felonies." Werner's thumb and forefinger performed that unconscious testing motion again, but now it looked less like professional assessment and more like a nervous tick. "You have fragments, speculation, nothing that would convince a jury. On the contrary." Wolfe gestured to the grid of postcards on his desk, each one positioned to catch the light from his green-shaded lamp. "We have your altered Croton Reservoir card, which you examined with proprietary satisfaction. We have Miss Bell's systematic documentation of your methods, stored safely beyond your reach. We have the client ledger retrieved from your workshop, listing 67 properties and fees totaling over $2 million. I watched Werner's face as each piece of evidence landed. His professional mask was dissolving like watercolor in rain, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. "More significantly," I added, "we have your admission that Miss Bell is being held at a location where she cannot cause further difficulties. That's kidnapping, counselor, regardless of how comfortable the accommodations." The office door opened with a measured authority that announced Inspector Kramer's arrival. He entered carrying an unlit cigar and the expression of a man whose patience with elaborate criminal enterprises had been exhausted sometime around the Coolidge administration. "Mr. Werner," Kramer announced, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, and breaking and entering. The specifics can wait, but the handcuffs can't." Werner's composure finally shattered completely. The careful facade of professional dignity collapsed, revealing raw desperation underneath. "Wait. You don't understand the scope of what you're destroying. Property values throughout Manhattan depend on documentation that has been accepted for decades. Insurance settlements, inheritance claims, tax assessments, all based on records that may contain minor discrepancies." "Minor discrepancies?" Wolfe repeated with the tone he reserved for euphemisms that disguised major crimes. "You mean systematic fraud designed to manipulate real estate valuations for financial gain?" "I mean practical solutions to complex problems." Werner's voice carried the desperate precision of someone trying to justify the unjustifiable. "My clients require historical documentation that supports legitimate business interests. The Whitmore Institute in the Adirondacks provides a controlled environment where researchers can work without outside interference." Mrs. Lake leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that where Hazel is?" Werner nodded reluctantly. 40 miles north of Albany, accessible only by private road. She's been there since Sunday, working under Dr. Edmund Carr's supervision. She's comfortable, well treated, continuing her research under appropriate guidance. Appropriate guidance meaning suppression of her findings, Janet Price observed from her position near the window, her camera documenting everything with professional precision. As Kramer's handcuffs clicked into place, Werner made one final attempt to salvage his position. "The documentation will surface eventually. Property records, insurance claims, tax assessments, all based on my work. Destroying my operation won't erase its consequences." Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a chess master who had achieved checkmate through superior strategy rather than superior force. "Mr. Werner, your greatest error was assuming that intellectual arrogance could substitute for moral authority. You created a house of cards built on manufactured history, but houses of cards collapse when subjected to genuine scrutiny." Kramer paused at the door. "Albany State Police will coordinate the rescue operation. We'll have Miss Bell back here by morning." As Werner was led away, his eyes fixed on the grid of postcards that had served as both evidence and trap. The objects of his professional pride had become the instruments of his downfall, each one a small piece in the larger map of his criminal enterprise. Mrs. Lake sat quietly in her corner chair, tears streaming down her face. "She's really safe. She will be within hours," Wolfe assured her. "Miss Bell's research has established methods for detecting similar fraudulent operations, ensuring that others who attempt to continue Werner's work will face the same systematic exposure." I began collecting the scattered evidence that would serve in Werner's prosecution, noting that the grid of antique postcards on Wolfe's desk remained in perfect order. The girl who sent no postcard was coming home, having delivered her message through silence more effectively than any correspondence could have managed. Sometimes the most important communication is the one that forces others to reveal themselves completely. The call from Albany came at 7:15 Wednesday morning, while Fritz was performing his morning ritual with coffee beans and I was contemplating whether Tuesday's lamb stew justified optimistic thoughts about Wednesday's breakfast. Detective Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried the particular satisfaction that comes from successful operations, completed without excessive paperwork. "We found her at the Whitmore Institute, exactly as Werner described. Morrison reported. Private research facility, locked doors, controlled communications. Miss Bell is unharmed and eager to return with enough documentation to prosecute half the antiquities dealers in the Northeast. I carried the news to Mrs. Lake, who was sitting in the front room with the patient endurance of someone who had learned that good news, like fine wine, improves with waiting. The relief transformed her face, erasing the worry lines that had accumulated over the past week, like interest on an overdue account. Hazel Bell arrived at 10:30, looking remarkably composed for someone who had spent 4 days as an involuntary guest at what amounted to a scholarly prison. She was thinner than I remembered, but her eyes held the bright determination of someone who had discovered something important and lived to document it properly. "Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin," she said, settling into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone who had learned to appreciate simple freedoms. "I owe you more than any postcard could ever express." "You owe us nothing," Wolfe replied, inclining his head the precise distance that courtesy required. "Your message was delivered with perfect clarity despite never being sent. Sometimes the most effective communication is the one that forces others to reveal themselves completely." She reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with photographs and documents. "I managed to document Werner's complete operation before they moved me to the Institute. Client files, fee schedules, technical specifications, everything needed to unravel the entire network." But it was the second item she produced that made Wolfe's eyebrows perform their familiar dance of professional interest. The other half of the torn Palisades postcard, its message side intact, bearing a neat pencil notation that read, "Chronological index, stamp diagnostics to transaction dates, 12 properties, 12 manufactured provenances." She placed it beside the picture, half that had started our investigation, and the torn edges mated with the precision of a key finding its lock. "The map I referenced in my notes," she explained. "Not geographical, chronological. Each of Werner's fabricated postcards corresponds to a specific property transaction where manufactured historical evidence could generate substantial financial gain." Wolfe examined the complete postcard with the intensity he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. "Explain the methodology." Werner identified properties where historical details could significantly impact valuations, insurance settlements, or legal proceedings. Buildings that existed longer than records indicated, landmarks with fabricated cultural significance, commercial properties with manufactured heritage value. She arranged several photographs on Wolfe's desk, creating a pattern that revealed the scope of the operation. "The technical sophistication was remarkable," she continued. "Werner used stamp box diagnostics, the small printed squares on postcards that indicate production periods. Azio-triangular corners meant 1904 to 1918. Diamond patterns indicated 1918 to 1930. By creating postcards with appropriate stamp boxes but manipulated imagery, he could prove that buildings existed at specific times to support fraudulent claims." I studied the photographs, seeing how each forged postcard supported a different financial deception. Insurance companies needed proof that buildings existed longer than actual records indicated to justify higher payouts. Property developers required documentation of historical significance to obtain landmark protection. Family trusts wanted evidence of cultural importance for tax exemptions. "Exactly," Hazel confirmed. "And the beauty of using postcards was their ubiquity. Thousands of variations exist, so creating new ones doesn't attract attention. They provide visual proof that most people accept without question, especially when displayed in reputable galleries." The doorbell rang with the measured authority that announced the arrival of our final act. I opened the door to find Silas Faber, looking like a man who had spent the night discovering that his entire professional reputation had been built on quicksand. "Mr. Faber," I said, "you're just in time for the complete explanation of how your gallery became the authentication center for systematic fraud." He entered the office with the resigned air of someone who had accepted that confession was preferable to prolonged uncertainty. Behind him came Inspector Kramer, carrying an unlit cigar and the expression of a man whose patience with elaborate criminal enterprises had reached its natural limits. "Gentlemen," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the particular weight that meant complete revelation was imminent. "We are gathered to examine how postcards became weapons in a war against historical accuracy." He gestured to the grid of antique cards still arranged on his desk, each one positioned to catch the light from his green-shaded lamp. Miss Bell's research has revealed that Mr. Werner's operation extended far beyond simple forgery. He was systematically rewriting New York's historical record to support financial fraud on an unprecedented scale. Faber settled into the yellow chair, his hands performing that unconscious testing gesture I had observed before. "I had no knowledge of the scope," he said quietly. "I believed we were simply exhibiting rare ephemera with interesting provenance." "Your ignorance was essential to the scheme's success," Wolfe replied. "Werner required your gallery's reputation to provide authentication by association. Once postcards appeared in a Faber and Pine exhibition, they acquired credibility that could be leveraged in legal and financial proceedings." Hazel opened her manila envelope and withdrew a series of photographs showing Werner's workshop equipment. Professional printing presses, aging chemicals, paper stocks dating back 50 years. He could replicate any historical printing method with perfect accuracy. "The chronological map," I said, indicating the rejoined Palisades postcard, "shows how each fabricated card supported specific property transactions. 12 cards, 12 dates, 12 manufactured provenances that generated millions in fraudulent gains." Kramer stubbed out his unlit cigar with unnecessary force. "Werner's been singing like a canary, with stage fright. Names, dates, properties, fee schedules, everything we need to prosecute the entire network. But I want to hear your version, Wolfe. How did a missing postcard lead us to the biggest document fraud case in the city's history?" Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which creaked its familiar protest. Miss Bell's decision not to send her promised postcard was the first indication that something had disrupted the natural order. Her subsequent failure to appear for scheduled meetings suggested deliberate concealment rather than simple forgetfulness. When her carefully prepared evidence arrived through alternative channels, it became clear that someone was monitoring her communications and movements. He picked up the altered Croton Reservoir card that had been tampered with in his own office. Werner's greatest error was his inability to resist examining his own handiwork. When he violated the sanctity of this office to alter evidence, he revealed both his presence and his professional pride. The Tsive testing gesture Mr. Faber unconsciously performs, the thumb and forefinger motion of someone who regularly assesses paper quality, was Werner's signature behavior. "And the wire transfer to Werner's attorney?" I asked. "Saul Panzer's arrangement, designed to confirm continuing financial relationships between Werner and his associates. When Mr. Pine received that transfer confirmation during our confrontation, his complicity became undeniable." Hazel smiled with satisfaction. "The girl who sent no postcard delivered the most important message of all, that sometimes silence communicates more effectively than words, and that the absence of expected information can reveal more than its presence ever could." As Mrs. Lake embraced her niece with tears of relief and gratitude, I reflected on the peculiar nature of this case. A postcard that was never sent had exposed systematic fraud, rescued a missing person, and restored integrity to historical documentation. Sometimes the most important communication is the one that forces others to reveal themselves completely. The brownstone had returned to its natural order, but the girl who sent no postcard had permanently altered our understanding of how silence could speak louder than Nero Dossier.